This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
I'm your host, Adam Zuckerman, and today we have a very special guest, Courtenay Shipley. Courtenay is the founder and planologist of Retirement Planology, a consulting registered investment advisory firm that specializes in corporate-sponsored retirement plans. With a wealth of experience in the retirement plan industry, Courtenay not only offers her clients expertise in investment analysis, plan design, employee education, but she also helps them leverage their benefits to support their own business goals. Pretty neat. She holds multiple professional designations and is the president of the Retirement Advisor Council. Courtenay, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. Let's hop in. So, personal journey. Talk a little bit about how you said, I want to dedicate the majority of my life on the retirement planning industry, because that's not something that you typically hear when you ask a kid what they want to be when they grow up.
Yeah, nobody really signs up to be like a super ERISA nerd, right? So what had happened was I went to college. I had a music degree. I needed a job. I did not want to move back into like my parents' basement or something. And I fell into the retirement plan space, as well as some insurance sales as well. And after a short stint, I decided, you know what, I really like the retirement side and the investments and helping people like figure out how they're going to make their paycheck later and be able to not work if they don't want to work. I love that part. Don't like the insurance part. How can I just stay focused on this? So yeah. And then my career has just led me from one series. It's a series of jobs in that field. So here I am 20 plus years later.
All right. What is retirement planology?
We're a consulting and investment advisory firm that specifically works with corporations and organizations on the plan that they offer for their employees. So think along the lines of 401k or 403b, something that has a tax code like that.
All right. So what are some of those components of the retirement plans that you're helping organizations consider when you're crafting their bundles?
Oh my gosh. So many things. We start usually with the back office, like how is this thing going to run? How is this not going to put more burden on your already burdened staff? Poor HR. There's not enough human resources in the human resources, you know? So we start there. Yep. We also look at what are the needs? What's this plan supposed to do for the company? So yeah, it's supposed to allow the employees to retire someday, but there's definitely a spectrum of companies who want to just nudge their employees in that direction to those who are like, let's get them signed up. They have to opt out. So working on what it means for their retention and recruiting aspect of things. How do they compare against their competitors? And then we move into what are the investments that are needed for this workforce? A lot of workforces are very different and they're in different stages of their life. How do we construct something that makes sense for the person who's signing on when they're 21 to the person who is 64 and a half, who's getting ready to retire next month? And then the last part, of course, is all the stuff with the DOL and the IRS and making sure people stay out of trouble.
We'll definitely get to that in a little bit. Now, How does retirement planning with these plans contribute to a smoother estate planning process for the employees of the companies?
All right. It is definitely part of the estate plan. So retirement plans like this, the company-sponsored ones, are covered by a federal law. So they're not as state specific, which is nice. Like if it's a 401k or a 403b, those are the two standards, or some sort of defined contribution plan like that. You're allowed to name a beneficiary, and that's going to marry up into the rest of how you have things set up, right? Mm-hmm. It's very important when a person is signing on to enroll in these types of plans that they are naming who gets this money if you're not around to receive it later.
All right. Now, does that have to be an individual, or could it be a trust or some other entity as well?
Yes.
Is it difficult to change those designations?
It's not. Actually, most of the time it's just going online and updating it. But you would be surprised at how many people forget about it. So we always try to do like a little, hey, it's springtime. Let's spring clean those beneficiaries, make sure you didn't get married, divorced, have another child, do an estate plan, et cetera, that you need to change your beneficiary for.
Those major life events. We recently heard a story from someone who was married, got divorced, remarried, passed away, and never updated their beneficiary from a previous job that they still had their plans through. And the ex-wife was still that designee. So fortunately, she transferred over. But how often do mistakes like that actually happen?
I mean, in my career, I've seen at least a handful. So we're not having people die left and right in our retirement plans usually, but it happens often enough that it's an issue.
All right. So April 16th, the day after everybody files their taxes, they should do a annual review of all their account beneficiaries. It's tip one for today's episode.
I like that.
Yeah. If you're going through, you've got life events, you're filing your taxes, you probably already have all your materials out, you know where everything is. Just a quick way to circle back. So,
Yep.
all right. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the role of those beneficiary designations and how they impact the overall estate plan. How do you choose who should be it? Should you ever say, no, I don't want to have a designee? What are the different considerations that you advise people on?
Well, let's start with no, I don't want a designee, or I just never got around to naming anybody. If you do that, then the plan document is going to have a sequence of who gets it next. So in other words, you are no longer deciding who will get your retirement account after you're gone. It will go in a progression that's usually spouse, next of kin, goes on from there. Is that bad? No, but it's definitely slows the process down quite a bit for it getting to the person or people that you actually wanted it to go to, or maybe they won't get it. So that's what happens if no beneficiary is named. It puts a lot of stress on the human resources department. It's no fun for anybody, and just don't do it. Now, as far as who you can name, the one thing I always caution folks against is naming somebody who's a minor child, because they can't access the money. And typically what ends up happening somewhere along the lines is that the court will appoint a guardian for them, and then that guardian is now the person that gets the money because the children are not old enough to receive it. That's not usually a great option either. If you already know who the person is that's going to be taking care of your children, why don't you just go ahead and put them in there for the benefit of those children? You mentioned trust earlier. You can definitely have language there that matches, everything else probably that you're putting into that trust. So that's an option as well. But typically what will happen is that your spouse is your primary beneficiary by default, unless you get them to say, I'm okay with you naming somebody else. So what happens?
You say primary designation or primary beneficiary there. Does that mean that you can have a secondary as well?
Yes, you can. So you start off with the primary. If something happens to both you and the primary, then the secondary would be where it goes next. And
do you have the ability to designate percentages between the two, or split it? Or is it an if the first person is no longer around, then the second person?
So in a primary secondary situation, then it would be that it goes to the primary first. If the primary is not around, then it goes to the secondary. However, if you want to name multiple beneficiaries, multiple primary, multiple secondary, you could do that. And you could say, I like this kid better, so they get 45%. The other two get 30. Whatever. I got no dog in that fight.
Don't do that. Keep it even. Don't make your kids and your loved ones fight people. It's not a good idea.
Not good.
All right. So impact on employee engagement and retention. Do employment retirement plans actually help companies?
Yeah, absolutely. Any benefits package is going to help a company, because in your hiring practices, you've got to say why an employee would want to come work there. And one of those things is that you offer good compensation, and your benefits package is part of your compensation. So absolutely, I think it does help attract and then retain, depending on how the plan is set up, those employees, because they generally are happier when they know the employer is giving them something for tomorrow, that day in the future when they don't want to have to show up anymore to get that paycheck.
Where do you see the state of the market being? What are companies offering in their retirement plans, and how are you helping them stay competitive?
Oh man, we're seeing all kinds of stuff right now. I would say profit sharing has become a very popular thing. So being able to not only reward your workforce with bonuses right now, but also a bonus for the future. That's one. Making sure that your employees really understand and appreciate the plan. So that usually comes through some sort of financial education component, helping them get maybe what they didn't learn from their parents, or maybe what they weren't learned poorly from their parents about their finances in order, and helping them put together their financial picture. Financial literacy is a big issue in this country. And so that tends to be something that's very attractive to companies as an extra benefit, but also as a way to give back to their employees, and hopefully contributes to their good culture and they stay there. So I'd say those are the top two things right now that we're seeing.
One of the things that we're focused on at Buried in Work is financial literacy. We want to help people understand the state of their finances so it weighs in and influences their proper estate planning. One of the statistics that we've talked about on other episodes is that on average, women outlive their male husbands in the country by an average of 5.8 years, which is terrible for a variety of different reasons, especially in traditional family households where there's a division of responsibilities. And obviously, this is not every household where the male or the partner is taking over the finances and the female side is just not involved as much. Because there's going to be such a mix of experience over the next 2 decades as people age out, Are you seeing companies helping their employees educate spouses as well? Or is it such a high lift just to educate the primary employee that it's not something that's top of mind?
It's a mix of both, but what I will say is COVID changed the paradigm because prior to COVID, the default way of getting messages to employees was to have somebody come on site and do a meeting for all the employees. So the spouse was never, invited. There was no way. It was on company time during the day. So after COVID, that's where we've seen a huge uptick in use of the virtual medium. So hopping on Zoom or Teams or something to have those types of meetings. And now the spouse can attend. And it's really made me happy, to be quite honest, because sometimes, like you said, it's a joint decision and you don't have the other person's input. And that's a problem. Or they feel very differently about using the plan than maybe the spouse does on the investment options or otherwise.
hmm That's interesting. I didn't think that COVID in a strange way would have a positive impact
I know,
on.
it's so strange what it influenced about our industry and other things. Mhm.
What are some of the other unexpected or unintended consequences that you've seen, not necessarily related to COVID, but just in general in the market?
There was a big law that was passed a couple years ago, the Secure Act. There was part one and then part two. What that did was greatly expand coverage for employees. So if you're a part-time worker now and you work 500 hours or more 2 years consecutively in a row, your employer has to let you at least use the plan. You put your own money in. So that's been really big. I would say that there's been a renewed interest in financial wellness as well from companies who saw people struggle through COVID and also, get back on their feet with all the stimulus checks that came through, but then they want to make sure that they're sustaining that going forward. So I saw a lot of that as well.
All right. And for listeners that are interested in learning a little bit more about the Secure Act, that's the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act that was signed into law in 2019. It came into effect shortly after that. But
That's right.
we've got an article on the website, and if people are interested, we can point you to that in the show notes.
And then part two comes later. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll have a second conversation. We'll see. What do you think that the market will shift towards in the future? So we are where we are right now. If you look back 30 years, people had pensions. Obviously, pensions are something that younger generations now aspire to have, but rarely get unless they're working for the government.
Yeah.
Instead, we're being encouraged to invest in our 401ks or 403bs for our kids, whatnot. Where do you see things actually going?
I think we're going to be in this situation for a while with you are in charge of your own retirement. We have Social Security, and believe it or not, Social Security actually works really well. It's a very, very good system, and we really need lawmakers to figure that out for the longevity of it, about how they're going to make changes to make it more viable. But it really does help the lower income people replace their working income, and it really does help supplement those who make more. And it's a huge part of our retirement system. So the 401k and the personal savings side of things, that's the most common way that people are saving for retirement in this country. It's also a very important part, but you have to remember the 401k isn't very old. No, it really gained popularity in the 1980s, and that was at the largest of companies. And then now it's become the more primary way for saving. So I think part of this is the first generation, the baby boomers who are actually retiring on and using the 401k plan. So I think there's still a little bit more to be seen. And I think lawmakers still have higher expectations for people being able to save in it and covering more people and things along those lines. But I think we're here for the time being until, some other major thing comes along.
All right. So let's shift then to the 401k. The maximum amount an employee can contribute to the 401k plan, I think, is $23,000 a year. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Ish. It goes up every year with inflation. So
yep. And
yes.
then when you're 50,
500 if you are over the age of 50. So
yep,
yeah.
over the age of 50, you get the catch-up contributions.
Yeah.
If someone gets a job, let's say in their mid-20s, they graduate college or they just get hired without a college degree, which is happening plenty now, and they contribute the max, and there's a 5%, 7% employee match or employer match. Is that enough for people? That's all they have to do? Or do you have to save and do things on the side as well? And what I'm trying to get at is it's difficult for people to plan and know what their actual requirement will be when they retire. How do you know if you're on track, and does a 401k actually meet that requirement?
All right. It's a big math problem.
Yeah.
But the problem is we don't have all the variables. What are you going to do in retirement? What are you going to want to do in retirement? How long are you going to live? How many years of retirement are you going to be in? This will never be an exact science. I think it's always going to be your best guess. And I'm not trying to dodge your question.
No. This is the real reality of it. So it's important.
This is the reality of it. I have an engineering client and it drives them bananas. When I meet with their employees and they're like, I don't know how long I'm going to live. If I knew that, I could work backwards and figure out how much to save. And that's why, the general rule of thumb is if you're saving somewhere between 10 to 15% of your pay, then that should get you in a pretty good position to make about 80% or to be able to pay out about 80% of what you're currently making in retirement. Now, does it always work? No. Do other people have different strategies? Yes. I mean, business owners, they may be relying on their business that they're going to sell at some point in the future as an asset. There could be, you've got real estate that you've bought or maybe you inherited it, since we're on this podcast. And so they're using that as a stream of income. So I think the most important thing when it comes to planning for retirement in your future is A, what do you want retirement to look like? And then B, how are you going to put that paycheck together? Because the earlier that you start thinking about that second part, the more time you have to save or make decisions or do things, right?
There's a old Simpsons quote, I think, that is, the sooner you fall behind, the more time you have to catch up. So maybe in a way, that's it. All right. Advice for employers. You work with a lot of companies. What advice would you give to the employers who are looking to improve their retirement plans for their employees?
The exercise where you just wipe the slate clean and start over. Think about it. Like, if we could do anything today, what would we do? Because if you can dream a little bit, sometimes you'll come to the better answer for your workforce than maybe what you already have in place. But half the time, honestly, this is out of sight, out of mind. They're like, somebody else takes care of that for me. And they don't have great advisors like us who are constantly saying, hey, does this really match up with what you're trying to do? Is this doing the right thing? So I think it's important to hire well when it comes to your advisors around you. And then second, just, go through that exercise every few years to say, is there anything that we really need to do differently here?
Courtenay, what advice would you give to employers that are looking to improve their retirement plan offerings?
I have a lot of advice. The first thing is don't ignore it. And if you could just wipe the slate clean and say, what if we were to start our plan over today, what would we want as the most ideal plan? It's worth spending the time and doing that exercise just to see where you end up. And also it can point you in the right direction for what do we want this plan to do and how can we make it better to our employees that we have now? And what kind of employees are we trying to attract in? So not ignoring it and putting it on the back burner is probably the most important thing.
What are those two things drilled down a little bit? So the first one is, if you were to start over today, how are things different than what they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Are there different options for companies to choose from, or is it just a different holistic approach?
So on that first point, you think about where your business was 5 years ago, and it's completely different probably than where it is today. So you may have a different employee base now. You also might be looking at different financial goals and different compensation packages. So if you think about how you designed your compensation package when you started, and you were bootstrapping things versus when you got to your 25th employee or otherwise, even maybe more than that, that spread of where the dollars go is probably very different today than it was back then. So that's what I mean when I say, let's just start from scratch. If we could just wipe this out, we don't have to think about anything. When would we make everybody eligible? What would we do for vesting? What kind of investment options do we need to have for the employees that we have today and the ones that we're trying to attract in tomorrow?
All right. Let's bust some misconceptions. What are some of those myths or misconceptions that people have about retirement savings, and what can they do to avoid those pitfalls?
From the employer standpoint, I think many employers, it is the last thing on their to-do list to pay attention to the retirement plan. So the most important thing is that you hire good people around you. And the myth that goes with that is someone else takes care of it. At the end of the day, you sign for it. It's still on you. You are still there to monitor what's going on. So making sure you have those regular meetings and you have evidence of how you've done the right thing in the best interest of the employees is super important. From an employee standpoint, I think the most common thing we hear is, retirement plans, that's for old people. I don't need to do that.
Really?
That's just not the truth, right? The earlier that you can get started, the better off you're going to be in the long run. I think we all know that. Time value of money, all of that good stuff. So yeah, and just taking an interest in it, trying to understand, because plans are different as you move from different jobs, and understanding the portability of it, all that kind of thing. That's good too.
All right. So what do you hope our listeners will take away from your insights on retirement planning, employee benefits, estate planning? If you have to leave one word of wisdom, what would it be?
Fill out your beneficiary form. How's that?
Okay. Nice and simple. I love it. And if people want to find you, Courtenay, how can they get in touch?
They can find me on LinkedIn, or they can go to our website, retirementplanology.com/learn more. And that'll take you to all of our tools and resources.
Sounds good. Well, Courtenay, thank you so much for your time. We enjoyed the conversation. That wraps up another Buried in Work podcast episode where we feature tips and stories from industry professionals who specialize in making estate planning, end-of-life tasks, and estate transitions more manageable. If you enjoyed the podcast, consider leaving a review, follow us on social media, or visit us at the website buriedinwork.com. And don't forget, podcast listeners can save 10% off of Buried in Work's estate preparation package and games with the code BIW podcast. Courtenay, thanks again. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Buried in Work podcast. Remember, you can save 10% on our estate preparation package and games with code podcast10 at buriedinwork.com.